What's up, everyone? This is Anthony Kim, and you can check out my COVID hair. All of the hair salons and barbershops have been closed in the Bay Area, and so you could see this is growing out. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is my conversation with Landon at the Colorado Education Initiative. We had this really interesting conversation about kind of the history of movements in education, what we're seeing now, how movements get created. And we even talk about like what are some of the shifts in the way we need to think about to create new movements and the partnership that's required with communities. So with that, I'm excited to introduce this conversation with Landon. Enjoy. Landon, we are recording now. So excited to have this conversation because I know some of the work that you're doing in Colorado, especially in terms of not just redesigning districts, but kind of thinking about the function of districts in a community. And I think that's the way I've been thinking about districts as well in the places where we work is like, what is the role of a school district right now? And it is top of mind right now. Like everyone has a different opinion of what the role of a school district is, you know, from education to childcare to jobs to health and safety and all of these things. And it's surprising how diverse our understanding of what a school district actually represents in our community is and what the most important aspect of it is.
Yeah.
So for this discussion, I think what I'd like to do is just lay out for this audience history. I think kind of repeats itself in some ways, but in a different form. And
it rhymes.
It rhymes. Yeah, I like that. So we talked a little bit about just the history from, you know, the one classroom schoolhouse to, you know, the Prussian system that Horace Mann brought in, and the idea of normal school and how we train teachers to like create sameness in all of the schools and repeatability. And then kind of busing allowed us to do other things. And then we had the reform movement with charters. And we're at a critical juncture right now. Can you just kind of walk us quickly through how you think about these kind of segments or milestones of education history?
As we go back to the beginning of our school system, we see these periods of shifts and changes as it's tried to meet the needs of the moment of the kind of social context it's a part of. And I think that we see two things at the same time throughout the kind of every phase of our history. One is that there's this deep belief, an aspirational belief, that the American education system can be a cornerstone of democracy, that it can be a place of formation where people can be imbued with a democratic spirit of learning and acceleration and opportunity and adaptability to the world that they're a part of. And then you see this other thing, which is that it's often very subject to the biases, structures, and nature of the moment it's a part of. And so our system's always running both of those pieces together. So whether you're talking about the formation of the American education system on the Eastern Seaboard, primarily for white men to be educated with that spirit, then the expansion to the one best system during the industrial era, where we could actually widgetize the entire system, to the civil rights era when we started to actually try to meet some of that democratic moment. And the moment that we're a part of now that previously was a part of an education reform era that failed to meet some of its promises, but created potentially some tools that now we can think through in the way and moment that we're a part of. Because fundamentally, we are asking ourselves a set of very tough questions about our education system right now in America. Number one, we're asking, is it still the cornerstone of our democracy? Is it still that place where we can have a formative experience for all kids, regardless of income, race, belief, era, and like what will it take to redesign that system to remain that cornerstone of democracy? Two, we are asking, can the American education system exist independently, a structure of social welfare that exists in Western Europe that we realize when it's taken away? When the American education system goes through a crisis like this, people go, oh, well, we have a childcare dilemma, we have an economic development dilemma. But in Western Europe, they don't see those challenges because their welfare state's structured around their education system, which allows them the opportunity to have a little more maneuverability in this moment than we have right now. And I think that we see also that's a part of the crisis we have in education right now, is a crisis of maneuverability. our options are limited because of the way our overall society is structured. And I think third is we have a social justice movement, racial awakening and reckoning happening at the same moment, which is calling into question a lot of the previously held assumptions of our American education system. And all those three factors combined really present us with this existential moment of not only how will we meet this massive public health crisis, but what will the form of the redesign take to meet the nature of those three questions?
I'm curious, you mentioned the ed reform movement, and I think a lot of money was invested in kind of charter school vouchers, whatever version of ed reform we talked about, but there are some learnings out of it. I think
Absolutely.
just by example, like I think we can show that students in deficient social economic conditions can still like perform really well with attention and care and high quality instruction. And you could actually bring together folks that can actually solve those problems in some districts. It's hard, but I think if you put the effort in and the focus, like we could actually make those changes. What are some of the things that you've seen in this reform that like we should keep? And what are some of the things that we should just stop doing?
I think that, man, I love the way you frame that. There's so much that the reform movement has given us, which I believe that are tools that we're able to utilize now. The problem is when any new movement that comes in questioning the dominant orthodoxy of the day begins to then say, don't question my orthodoxy, that's when we get into trouble. And that's what the ed reform movement kind of caught up with itself, is saying like, we're challenging the status quo that says that all kids can't learn, that says that we can't have data systems, that we can't have local control, that we can't have nimble agileness in the way that we have autonomy. And then when we started having challenges to that around like, well, what does it mean from a racial equity lens when the special education students aren't being served in some of those systems? And what does it mean when the families and communities that you're a part of aren't designing those systems for you? Then it's like, whoa, like, wait a second, don't question this orthodoxy. Then that's where I think we've seen a lot of the backlash and the challenges and the instability in that. Fundamentally, though, I think there's a few things we should be taking away from the education reform movement that we can actually pull into our space. And I think we should probably just say education reform movement, education justice movement, like essentially the set of tools that we are given, which is the ability to have innovation be a primary driver of a lot of change. I think that like we see a lot of American education systems now, we see a lot of superintendents, whether they're pro or anti-charter, like they're willing to change their systems. They're willing to try to change their systems. And I think that we have a lot of state level and federal policy tools that enable local leaders to be able to do something about it. Second, I think that we actually have learned a lot of lessons about the ability for outcomes to be pretty outstanding across groups. And we've learned that across governance types, in particular here in Colorado. And third, I think that's really important to think through is that we've learned a lesson from the failure of the education reform movement to be able to pull in the voices of families and communities from the outset, co-creating with them, and then co-producing in the long term. And I think that's a lesson and structure that actually the tools and mechanisms that they fought for actually allows us to do more than ever through things like innovation schools, community schools, charter schools. If we pull those voices in, those forms actually become magnified. And in this moment of reckoning and wondering, we need those voices more than ever.
The innovation is what is important. There's not a charter organization that actually figured out their model that is repeatable across the network, right?
Across everywhere.
Yeah, across everywhere. And different models across this network, different networks also work.
Yeah.
And so obviously it's not a model problem.
No.
It's an effort and intention issue and a people issue.
It's right. And if like, and this is I love quoting Star Trek, but there's a Star Trek episode where the captain goes, context is king, Yeah. And I think that education reform kind of forgot that for a second. Mm-hmm. Context is king. And if context is king, then what does it ask us to do with our communities? It means that we should partner with them deeply.
Yeah, and just to kind of double click on what you said around the lack of inclusiveness that the reform movement created with the institutions.
Yes.
Reminds me of some of the challenges we've had with kind of the social justice and race issues in the country, because sometimes we've looked down on certain folks or, said they're not doing it right. And I feel like in some ways, like the reform movement did a little bit of that and made people very defensive.
The every successful movement is being led by those who are most affected by the problem. And I think that is and remains a very fair critique of the like 90s, early aughts reform movement. The education justice movement, the education redesign movement I see happening now, it's more and more led by folks from the communities that are most impacted. And I think that's really an inspiring thing, because it allows for a understanding of that context, an understanding of the root issues of that change. And that doesn't mean that our white allies and friends shouldn't be a part of the cause too, fundamentally. But it also says that like we need to name who is furthest from opportunity and who should speak with that community. And I think that's a really important question that we should be asking when we do redesign work.
Can you talk a little bit about how movements are created and also this shift that we're seeing from sameness and getting everything exactly the same and repeatability and what people call scalability in that way versus I guess the notion of like individuals and diversity and broad ideas.
I think that is, we look back at the beginning of the 20th century and we see the efforts to create the one best system. The one system that we can repeat, copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste. A superintendent, a school board, a CAO, principals, teachers, and it's this hierarchical structure that we see repeated, and that all the biases of that time are calcified inside, right? It's the sexism, it's the racism of that system, because the hierarchy reinforces those isms and actually pulls them in. And in particular, from my experience working in the Navajo Nation, New Mexico, you see colonialism just like baked into all of that one best system. And as you repeat that closed system over and over and over again, you see the same things magnified and replicated. A part of the work we have to move to now is cracking open all those closed systems and asking fundamentally different questions around what should this education model look like in this community it serves? Is it a small group tutoring program? Is it a large expeditionary learning school? Is it and I work with some schools that are doing a lot of economic development work in rural Colorado. Is it actually fused in partnership with your local industry and organizations and families to design opportunities for all kids to thrive in a rural context where the economy's been struggling? That has to be the next phase of the work. And you and I have talked about this, Anthony, but a lot of people want it to, what's the next thing we're getting to? What's the next thing we're getting to? And fundamentally, that's the work is the next thing we have to go to. We have to commit to the work of cracking open all those systems, opening them up, and doing the deep, hard work of co-creating and co-producing what is new. And we have to release comparability from something that we feel like we have to have. It's like we have to accept emergence, and we have to accept the opportunity for new things to flourish that maybe never would have flourished before.
Just the concept of dieting is fascinating to me, because like so many people focus on, I got to lose 10 pounds instead of like changing their eating habits. And it's actually, I feel like the education system's kind of like that right now.
That's a great analogy. I love that analogy.
How can we shift towards nutrition versus like losing the weight?
We have to, this is the change yourself, change the world thing, right? Like we have to model it in ourselves. So you're leading an organization doing amazing work all over the country. What is the work that you're going to do to say, how do I co-create with the community partners that I have in my world? How am I going to co-produce with them? What are they going to teach me? How am I going to open my heart to that learning? And I have to do the same thing in my role here at CEI. I have to say, who are my partners in the field? Who are the leaders I'm learning from? How am I going to open up to that? And then what am I going to do with my team that's around that? And how is the organization going to do that? And then how as a field are we going to build out the patterns and learnings so that we can co-create and co-produce with everyone with everyone? And it has to be about showing the path. Showing the path is like, we're going to get there, and we can't overwhelm people. We can't top them over at the very beginning and say, you're about to do an impossible thing. You're going to crack open the most closed system in American society, and you're going to build it with everyone in your world. And they're going to be like, oh my God, that's really intense. And we have to help them go on the journey. We have to be by their side. We have to lock arms in solidarity and say, I'm with you, school district. We're going to do this together. And through our work together, we have a chance to do something, our generation and our generation's precedent, they never really got a chance to do. They got to open up all this opportunity for your community, and let's redesign it together.
Awesome. I'm really glad we had this conversation. I think it's so relevant to the things that we need to reflect on and work on for at least the next couple of months. And then the real work starts in January 2021 in my head. Like, we got to get organized, mobilized, and start making the changes before the next kind of school year starts. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Landon. I think one of the key takeaways I had was just the learnings that we've had from kind of the last movement, which we would kind of commonly call the education reform movement. And the three things that I think as an industry we've learned is that innovation is a great driver for change. That's number one. And two, that we now have a mindset and evidence that all groups can actually achieve academic success. And three, it's essential that we partner with communities and parents at the very early stages of developing a model or a program. And so really trying to understand what their needs are, but also creating that ownership that's so essential. So if I had to give you a takeaway from this interview, I think it would be those three kind of key lessons learned. Peace.